Hey there. Welcome to The Climate Cycle, a podcast focused on Canada's climate tech ecosystem. In each episode, we sit down with founders building climate solutions right here in Canada to better understand the challenges presented by climate change and what we can do about it. Today on the podcast, we're talking with Emily Farrar, the co-founder of Genuine Taste. They're a startup working at the frontier of food, developing cell-based fats for plant-based and alternative protein products. It's a sector that's evolved quickly over the past 10 years or so, going from niche health food stores to IPOs from companies like Beyond Meat. But despite that early momentum, adoption of alternative proteins is starting to stall a bit. Consumers are open to cutting back on meat and trying new alternatives, but they're not really willing to compromise on taste or pay a huge premium for it. Genuine Taste is tackling that challenge at its source by cultivating real animal fat using cells grown in bioreactors. Their product delivers the same taste, texture, and nutritional profile as conventional fat, but without the animal suffering or climate footprint. This matters because animal agriculture is responsible for around 15% of global carbon pollution and many other impacts on our ecosystem, like changing land use. Shifting even part of that system towards low-emission, cell-based ingredients could have a major impact on the planet. In our conversation, Emily and I dig into the science behind cultivated fat, what makes their bioreactor setup almost 100 times more efficient than some competitors, and how they're thinking about market entry. We also talk about building a biotech startup in Canada and some of the synergies with our agriculture industry, the evolving regulatory landscape and some of the innovations that are happening around the world, and how they're avoiding the pitfalls of the last alternative protein hype cycle. A quick disclaimer before we jump in, I'm a small investor in Genuine Taste. And now, here's my conversation with Emily. Emily, welcome.
Hi, Justin. Thanks for having me on. Nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. I'm glad we could set this up. I'd love to talk a little bit about what you're building at Genuine Taste, but maybe we could start with a bit of your backstory. Can you give us a quick intro to how you got started in this space?
Yeah. So I'm Emily. I'm the CEO of Genuine Taste. I actually kind of had an indirect path. So originally, background was in civil engineering. I pursued that because I was really interested in climate change mitigation, and I thought that was the best path to do so. So studied that for quite a while. Ended up working for a few years in climate tech commercialization consulting in the Bay Area. And then the more I was in the field, the more I realized I wanted to be at the forefront. So I wanted to be the person forming a company. I wanted to be on the cutting edge, driving things forward. Ended up meeting my co-founder at a founder networking event. So funnily enough, we met online during the pandemic on a founder matching site. So kind of a unique origin story. And my co-founder is an expert in biophysics. So really the impetus for the key technical differentiation and where we thought we would have an edge in terms of commercializing this technology and technical differentiation really came from his background in cell culture. But we really matched on mission, so wanting to reduce impact on the environment and also from an ethical point of view.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting kind of origin story. Could you tell us a little bit about Genuine Taste now and kind of what you're developing there?
Yeah, so at Genuine Taste, essentially we're recreating real animal fat with enhanced nutrition and flavor. If you think of the plant-based meat sector or the alternative protein sector, there's a lot of interest from consumers in trying these products, whether from an environmental perspective or a health perspective. And so we're seeing, for example, in North America, around a third of consumers are actually flexitarians. So those are people who are increasingly incorporating alternative meat options into their diet. But the problem with this particular sector is a lot of these products don't quite perform well enough right now. So they might have off notes, they might have to have long ingredient lists with 20 plus ingredients in order to kind of mimic the experience that people are used to from conventional meat. And so that's a big problem for the industry because they're not seeing widespread consumer adoption. When we think about what makes conventional meat products delicious, it's actually the fat component of these products. Here at Genuine Taste, we said, okay, well, perhaps the best way to recreate that experience then is to make the fat. Essentially, we're recreating real animal fat. To do that, we isolate a small sample of cells from an animal. These cells are then fed with nutrients and bioreactors, and then we produce fat at the end. And one of the great things about this technology is that we can actually customize for different fatty acid profiles or volatile organic compounds that give the flavor to the fat. So we can customize or tailor the fat for the particular application.
Yeah, the flexitarian market, I think, is a really interesting takeaway there because I think the initial instinct is that this is for vegetarian and vegan consumers, but there's this whole other group out there that is maybe swapping in some plant based meats here and there in their diet, or they're kind of curious about it and want to try it, or are looking to cut down on whatever type of meat and make some alternatives. So it's interesting that it's not necessarily this kind of like yes or no type of market. There's kind of this in between customer profile. I'd love to unpack a bit more about why fat is such a critical piece of the puzzle here, because I think it's, again, this overlooked area where you're thinking, okay, we need to develop better meats. We need like
Yeah.
it to feel more like
There's
muscle.
so much focus just on the protein aspect. I really feel like especially the first gen for the
Yeah,
companies for the food tech and climate tech sector, it's all protein focused and people
definitely.
weren't thinking of the full food product.
Yeah. So, what have we found out over the past couple of years? Fat seems to be this kind of missing piece of the puzzle. Could you talk about where does this fit into kind of driving that adoption?
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons why fat is so competitive is I think in the past few years, there's been a lot of research into the alternative meat sector or alternative protein sector. And a lot of research has found that the main barriers to adoption are usually just price and taste. And if you're not winning on those two fronts, people just as much as from a mission perspective, they really want to eat these products, they're not going to change their behavior. And so I think that's really where fat is the key because fat gives all of those functional characteristics. So it gives mouthfeel, it has savoriness and aroma. Fat is just delicious. And I think especially when we're trying these novel ingredients that are a little more high tech, it also has the advantage of if it's more expensive to start with, it's a smaller percentage of the product, say 3 to 5%. And so you can commercialize it more easily than, for example, if you were making an alternative burger, it's like, say, 80% protein. And so if you've got a novel ingredient that's more expensive, it's really difficult to reach price parity, which is what consumers really need to adopt these products.
So, if the cultivated fat is one ingredient with a higher price tag, but the rest of the actual product itself is maybe like chickpea based or something like that
Yeah.
with a lower cost, because your ingredient is a small part of it, the overall cost is much more competitive as opposed to the whole thing is a alternative
Yeah.
meat with a higher cost. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, exactly. Like when you're first commercializing, like you're allowed to be more flexible with the input ingredients while you're
Right.
waiting to reach price parity with conventional alternatives. So that's what we're thinking in terms of commercialization. We're planning to approach the market first with these hybrid products that are a combination of, like you said, chickpea or pea-based protein ingredients with our fat added to improve flavor and nutrition.
Okay. And so I think it's helpful to ground this conversation in kind of where this fits within climate change and the impact there. You know, beyond the grocery store aisle or what's in your fridge, there's a big climate story around this. Could you unpack the impact of conventional meat and agriculture and maybe where some of these alternatives fit in?
Yeah, great question. So when we're thinking about conventional animal agriculture, essentially right now around 15 to 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions actually originate from conventional animal agriculture. So that's a combination of all of the emissions that go into clearing land, growing crops, growing the animals themselves, all of the processing associated, and it's a really energy intensive sector. And I think it's one that's particularly been neglected when we think of climate tech. Not many people think of food and ag when they think of climate tech.
Right.
On top of that, not just from a greenhouse gas point of view, it's also incredibly detrimental to the environment, often in terms of land consumption. Around 77% of agricultural land is used to grow crops that are just to feed animals, and there's a lot of clearing of rainforest, a lot of monocultures, which aren't particularly good for biodiversity, and it's also very water intensive. It's around 2,700 liters of water to produce just 1 kilogram of beef.
That's
From many
wild.
angles, the way we eat has an incredible impact on the planet. And so There are a lot of other great sustainable alternatives. So you can try grass-fed beef, that's free range, but that takes up a lot of land. And with the current population that the world supports and growing populations, that's not really feasible to meet the world's protein needs. There are a lot of great plant-based alternatives that consumers are increasingly interested in, but there are problems with consumer adoption. People aren't quite ready to take them on. Sometimes they also suffer from higher price points. I think there's room for all of these solutions moving forward, but we need diversity and we need a lot of innovation in this sector in order to meet the world's protein needs while also reducing our emissions.
Yeah, I love that. I think your point about diversity is very well taken. And I think in most fields, that's kind of the answer is it's not going to be one, runaway solution. It's going to be five different ones or six
Yeah.
different ones that kind of all together move the needle on impact. So I'd love to get into what you're building today. Could you unpack what cultivated fat actually means and kind of like how that gets created?
So, the way cultivated fat is created, essentially, you start with a seed culture. So, you isolate cells from an animal. In our case, we take the cells from an animal with a biopsy. So, the animal isn't harmed in order to retrieve the cells. And so, you're actually working, in our case, with stem cells that are the predecessors to fat cells. These cells are placed in a seed train and then into bioreactors. They're fed with nutrients, so think amino acids and other nutrients, and then they grow, they differentiate into fat, and then at the end of the process, you create real animal fat. It sounds a little strange, but it's actually no different than what happens within the animal's body. So if you think of a cow, for example, it's made of many different cells. The cow is breathing, it's eating grass, and so these cells are also growing and accumulating fat. It's just instead of happening in an animal that we then kill, we're instead doing it inside of a bioreactor.
Very interesting. Okay, so it's really mimicking that natural process. I'd love to unpack what that bioreactor kind of looks like and also how your approach differs from some of the other companies that are also tackling cultivated or cell based fats. I read somewhere that your reactor setup needs like just a fraction of the physical space and footprint as some of your competitors. So yeah, maybe you could talk to us about like what actually is a bioreactor, what does that look like, and how does your approach kind of stack up?
In terms of what a bioreactor looks like, they're actually already really commonly in use. So if you think of a brewery where beer or other types of alcohol is produced, those are actually bioreactors. So essentially, a bioreactor is just a big steel tank that you place things in.
Right.
Doesn't sound very sexy, but that's what it is. In terms of technology differentiation, we've developed a novel scaffolding setup that enables us to produce fat in more compact bioreactors. Many of our competitors have a big steel tank. They have little beads of material that the cells attach to and grow on, which they need to in order to exchange nutrients with the surrounding liquid they grow in. It's a relatively simple process, which is great, but it takes up a lot of space. So it's not very efficient and quite expensive, especially considering media, which is the liquid that these cells are growing in that contain the nutrients, is a pretty expensive ingredient in this
Hmm.
sector. In our case, we've developed a 3D edible scaffold that the cells grow on and within. These cells grow much more densely. The media flows through the scaffold. So the cell, instead of floating in a big tank, there's much more direct transfer of nutrients. And essentially, we're able to really reduce the volume needed to grow our fat. And so that reduces a lot of the capex because instead of, say, having a 100,000 liter bioreactor, we can, say, produce the same amount in a 1,000 liter bioreactor.
Okay, wow. That's a pretty significant order of magnitude
Yeah.
improvement with that scaffolding.
Yeah.
So it's mainly then the scaffolding that's driving that efficiency. Could you talk about like what are some of the cost inputs to a system like this? The
Yeah.
stem cell itself seems fairly straightforward, but I'm sure there's a lot of components going on here.
Yeah. I'm just pulling up our TEA for you. Yeah. So for our particular system, like you said, the cells themselves, they don't cost that much. We have to isolate the cells, but once you do that, you can immortalize the cells and they're sort of self-renewing. You don't have to keep doing that isolation process. So really the most expensive parts of this process are the media, like I mentioned, the media consists of different growth and differentiation factors, and that can be quite expensive. Most of the innovation in this space is towards developing novel media formulations where you reduce the number of growth or differentiation factors. There's a big race to reducing the price of media from, say, $50 per liter to instead getting it below $1 per liter. So
Okay.
that's one part of the process. For us, one of the great things about being in Canada is we don't have to spend a lot on capex, because what can be expensive is the bioreactors that are used to create this product. That can be pretty significant capex. But here in Canada, we actually have an amazing ecosystem with many different contract research organizations and universities where we can produce our product within their bioreactors, and we don't have to make a lot of those upfront expenditures. Other than that, most of the expense really comes down to labor and energy. This is yet another space where I think Canada has a key competitive advantage, because compared to the US, we have highly talented individuals and they're much cheaper than the US counterparts. And then from an energy perspective, Canada has abundant renewable resources that are very affordable. That's really great, especially from a climate tech perspective. There have been some life cycle assessments of this technology, and really what comes down to if this is more environmentally friendly than conventional counterparts is really the energy that's used to produce the cultivated fat or meat. So if you're running a facility on coal or natural
Yeah.
gas, it might be just as bad as conventional meat. But if we're able to take advantage of the hydro or nuclear resources that Canada has, then you can actually hit those climate goals.
Very interesting. The actual energy inputs make up a significant part of the carbon footprint for a
Yeah,
cultivated fat.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So I'd like to talk about what's your kind of target customer here?
Yeah.
Because we talked a little bit about your kind of typical alternative proteins like a Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods, but what are the markets that you're looking at? Maybe even as like the first market to enter, and maybe there's like kind of subsequent phases.
Yeah, for market entry, actually, one interesting sector that we're looking at is the pet food sector. So
Okay.
we've seen a lot of interest from pet food manufacturers for this particular ingredient as a palatability agent. So when you think of pet food treats or kibble, they're actually often coated in a layer of fat that often has flavor agents. And so that's what really draws the pet in to eat the product. The one problem that the pet industry faces is they're often using ingredients that are either A, expensive, or B, they have really inconsistent nutritional profiles, because they're, say, using tallow, which is a waste product, and that can cost them a lot in terms of lost batches or storage cost, for example. And so there are real benefits to using this particular technology for that sector. And also, it has the benefit of the regulatory pathway isn't quite as long as human food in different
Mm,
geographies. So, we've actually seen within the last year, there have been a lot of great new cultivated pet food companies pop up. There's one called Neatly in the UK, one called Biocraft in the EU. So that's one potential market entry point for us, our fat as a palatability agent for pet food. Another potential market entry point within the next few years is in the human food sector, looking at our product for hybrid applications. So, our fat as a flavor enhancer or adding particular fatty acids to a hybrid product. Hybrid means plant based protein with some either conventional meat or cultivated meat or fat products added.
mm. That's really interesting. And you mentioned consistency there. That seems like an interesting sell for some of your customers in that you have, I would imagine, in a bioreactor in a kind of more controlled environment, it sounds like you would have a lot more control over the consistency of the output of like the actual fat that's being produced. Is that something that you're able to control as an output? And are there other kind of levers that you have working in more of that controlled environment?
The ability to control the nutritional profile and the flavor profile of our fat is one of the biggest selling points of this product. Part of what determines the flavor profile or the fatty acid profile of the cell is what you feed it. So when you're thinking about growing this fat in bioreactors, we have direct control over the recipe of what we feed the cells and also the physical environment. So to give an analogy, I don't know if you know much about conventional animal agriculture, but for example, if you have grass-fed beef, the meat from that product tends to end up with a different fatty acid profile than if you have grain-fed beef. So it's what you're feeding the cells or the animal determines the nutritional profile of the product. So when we're creating our own product, we're able to directly control what we feed the cells and what their physical environment looks like, which gives us a lot of precision. And we actually recently won a grant from one of the organizations within Canada to build an AI model that enables us to essentially figure out what inputs impact the resulting flavor profiles.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. That's a great kind of jumping off point because I was really interested about the intellectual property side of this because you have the bioreactor that's like, okay, it's in breweries, it's out there. What are some of the like the differentiating IP that you have? Is it the scaffolding or is it kind of a combination of some different things?
Yeah, it's a combination of many things. Part of it is the production platform, so the scaffolding that we grow the cells on, how the scaffolding is functionalized. For example, how the cells attach to the scaffolding. That's novel IP that we've developed. Our media formulation is novel IP, so that'll be trade secret. Even how, like, where we isolate the cell, how we immortalize the cell is also IP. We're working to incorporate machine learning techniques to change the flavor profiles of our fats. So those models will also be IP. This particular technology is a super IP rich one.
Yeah,
I think when a lot of people think of the food sector, they just think of like, I don't know, making potato chips and they're like, okay, it's
right.
it's simple, it's cheap. This is pretty high tech stuff.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think there's the first thought is it's all about production and kind of like manufacturing and scale and things like that. But, your point is well taken. There's a lot of IP around even like the cell selection and things like that. Like there's a lot there. How are you thinking about the kind of commercialization approach? Do you see Genuine Taste being a fats producer, like an ingredients production company? Are you thinking more of like a licensing model? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of our commercialization platform or pathway, we essentially intend to be a company that discovers novel fats or makes different types of fats for different applications. We do plan to produce and manufacture our own fat, at least within the first like 5 to 10 years as demonstration and to prove out the unit economics of this particular technology, but we're also open to licensing in the long term. I think licensing is a great play to work with more customers and increase the margins on our particular product. There are many great companies around the world. This is still a relatively novel space. And so there are many companies around the world, but they're each highly specialized. And there aren't so many companies working on fat. So I think if we can do a licensing play and team up with some of these bigger players who are, say, focusing on making muscle tissue or
Right.
ingredient companies around the world, that's a great way to help this product grow and commercialize.
Gotcha. Yeah, and from what I've seen, some of your competitors too are like hyper focused in terms of like
Yeah,
we're going to do pork fat or
exactly.
things like that. But it sounds like you have a bit more of like a generalist approach, in that
Yeah.
you have more of a platform approach to fats that could kind of like tailor it to different needs.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this also comes down to our core IP being around being able to produce the fat more densely. So the core IP is compatible with different types of fat tissue. So I think that also gives us an advantage where we can try out different types of fat.
Gotcha. Okay. Something I wanted to kind of talk to you about was you recently had a agreement with the Better Butchers out in British Columbia. Could you talk a little bit about what that partnership means and kind of how you're thinking about partnerships a little bit more generally?
Yeah. So our partnership with the Better Butchers is a great opportunity because it really enables us to test our product with a customer in the field. So see what their direct feedback is on the performance, see how it compares if they make their product, I don't know, with just coconut oil versus with some of our fat or all of our fat. So I think it's a great testing ground for our product and for us to get feedback. And it's also a great opportunity to help support other Canadian companies and make them more competitive on the global market. So hopefully, our fat makes their product much more delicious and they're able to speed up their own commercialization journey. And as a company, I think in the early days of this sector, there was a lot of hype. It was very much driven by venture capital, these huge checks. And I think it made these companies a little bit insulated and they weren't perhaps working as closely with customers. So, really, we want to drive our growth according to where our customers see value, where we're getting a lot of traction with customers. So, over the next few years, we do plan to engage in pilots, work closely with customers as we scale our technology.
Very cool. I think your point about that initial boom driven by a lot of VC dollars, it led to a particular, I think, type of business and it really shaped the market in a specific way. How does that change how you're thinking about building the business? And we can get into the capital and the fundraising side, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
maybe just building off of that customer oriented approach. How are you thinking about, or like maybe lessons you've learned from some of your competitors in that kind of boom phase that's now shaping how you're building the business?
Yeah, we might have to take this piecemeal. It's a
Yeah.
complicated story. But yeah, I think the first lesson we really got from the first generation of cultivated meat companies is how important it is to rely on existing infrastructure and expertise. I think a lot of these companies, because they were trying to move so fast and commercialize so quickly, they kept everything inside the company.
Okay.
There wasn't much knowledge sharing. They were buying all of their own equipment, which was very expensive. And some of them have made it through, but some of them didn't. So I think that like seeing the space evolve has really taught us how important it is to rely on the ecosystem that's available in Canada. So I mentioned it earlier, but for example, there are several scale up partners located throughout Canada that you can partner up with and scale up your technology, work out your processes, make those mistakes using their equipment before you build your own facility. And so that's a really important tactic for us as a company.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess, a lot of those companies did kind of kick down the door in this field in a pretty big way. Like it's a market, it's a thing. It's been very cool to see that emerge. So maybe we can take that second part of the question and talk about how you're thinking about the capital side of this. I could see this being a very capital intensive type of business. You have physical infrastructure, but you've talked about, you're leaning heavily on partners for that. How do you think about building the capital stack for a business like Genuine Taste?
For us, in terms of attracting capital, I think we're definitely taking a customer first approach. For us, it's really important to identify the right customers, show that they're really interested in this product. For us, the mission critical path we took is instead of spending a lot of time making sure everything was perfect, we were really pushing for customer relationships. And we actually managed to secure one where they bought a sample from us. And so we're able to create a relationship where we do iteration with them instead of spending years gathering a lot of capital to make something
Yeah.
perfect and then maybe there's no interest in this product after all. So that's been really important for us, is making sure to drive technical innovation, but at the same time we want to make sure there's customer interest in what we're creating. So that's been really important for us. And then I think that also helps us avoid some of the hype cycle. So for example, sometimes there's a lot of hype in a particular industry and so it's great timing, you get a lot of investment,
Right.
and then sometimes there's not that hype. I think if you're driving from a customer interest point of view, then you don't have to worry as much about where you fall within that hype cycle. That's one approach we're taking. And then I think also Canada's a great environment to grow because once you do have some capital, you're able to match it with non-dilutive funding. That helps companies in the early days. Maybe we're a few years from commercialization because we have to go through regulatory approval. The non-dilutive funding helps us extend that runway.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's interesting, the customer driven approach. It seems like you kind of have two different speeds. So, the investor speed or the broader cultural speed is like a little bit more prone to like hype cycles and dips and things like
Yeah.
that, where it sounds like the customer side maybe is a bit of a longer term. I would imagine if
Yeah.
you're like a large food company, you're taking a
They can be a bit
multi-year
slow.
view. Right. And that's, I guess, kind of the trade-off is it can be
Yeah,
slow
yeah.
there.
I think the benefit there, though, is often some of these customers, if they really see the value in the product, they're willing to help fund or pay upfront for a pilot, for example. And so that can be really helpful, even if it's a bit slower. And unfortunately well, it's great for the consumers, but it's tough if you're a startup. We do have to wait for regulatory approval. So there are certain points at which there can't be any rushing for this particular product.
Yeah, for sure. Are there trends or shifts that you've seen in investor sentiment over the past couple of years, like while you've been building this? Because from what I've seen, like there is more of an interest now in kind of ingredients and kind of the fundamental parts. But I'm curious, like as you've been talking to investors and people in the ecosystem, are there any like signals that you've noticed?
I would say when we first started the company in 2022, so that was at the very tail end of the raises by the first gen of cultivated meat companies.
Right.
So there definitely was more of a focus on just the interestingness of the product or the innovativeness of the sector, not so much like the company itself. I would say over the last few years, I would say first it shifted to more of an emphasis on platform technologies or CDMOs as media companies, so the enablers of those
Okay.
companies. And now I would say most of the focus is on functional ingredients, so companies that have identified a high value sector to start with, and then they have a clear story for how in the long term they'll scale and reduce price. So I would say that's what I'm seeing right now from an investor side.
Yeah, interesting. Which I mean is a very sounds like a very positive signal for you, and that
Yeah, it's
the
an
sentiment
ingredient
is
company. It's a great
yeah.
great place to be.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned a couple times about regulatory hurdles, and I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle here. Could you talk about where we're at in this regulatory environment? Are there changes coming, or is this more just you need to go through the hoops and put forward the application and it'll take a bit of time, or are regulatory attitudes shifting around this space as well?
Yeah, so great question. Regulatory attitudes definitely are changing. So I think for this particular sector, now is actually a very exciting time because the regulatory environment is going to be very positive for this sector in the coming years because we now have at least three countries that have established regulatory pathways and companies have gotten approval. So that's the US, Singapore, Israel, maybe also South Korea. I'm not sure though. You would
Hmm.
have to fact check me on that one. So that's great. And then a lot of companies within the last year, over 30 companies have established regulatory pathways for cultivated meat. Before that, I
Okay.
think it was only like 5 or 10 countries had established pathways. Here in Canada, actually, Ontario Genomics released a great report on the cell agriculture industry and what it means for Canada. And there have been increasing calls within Canada to establish a clear regulatory strategy and pathway. So I think there's more collaboration and vision around needing to develop domestic strategies for the regulatory environment for the cell ag sector. So cell ag includes both precision fermentation and cultivated sector. In the UK and several environments, I believe also South Korea, we also have regulatory sandboxes, which is something I hope Canada does soon. So that's 10 companies, for example, will work hand in hand with a regulatory agency to develop their application. But
No.
within the last year, we've seen, for example, one of our competitors just got regulatory approval in the US, which was a great sign. I was really scared about the Trump administration, but
Right.
they got regulatory approval after he was elected. And then we've also seen a couple of cultivated pet food companies who have gotten regulatory approval recently.
Okay, that's a really positive sign to see companies like making it through the process and getting that approval. Your point about the regulatory sandboxes is really interesting. And I think that would be such a great model to see here, where Canada has an incredibly strong agricultural sector, particularly in plant based proteins. But then we also have an exceptionally strong life sciences sector as well. Like we're very strong on the science talent around this. It seems like such a perfect fit to marry those two industries and lead in this space.
Completely
Um,
agree.
one other thing on the adoption side, I was really interested to get your thoughts on. So you mentioned for consumers, taste, cost, those are big drivers. Another one that's really, I think, emerged quickly over the past couple of years in particular is health concerns and this idea of clean ingredients and things like that. Could you talk about like how you're thinking about this, or maybe even like what you're seeing in the market?
Yeah, that's a great question. After price and taste, usually health is another reason people adopt plant-based ingredients. And unfortunately, one of the reasons the plant-based meat sector hasn't grown as explosively as expected is because they often have long ingredient lists. So because of the difficulty in achieving the same performance or functional characteristics, they often have to add a lot of emulsifiers or flavor ingredients, and you have on an average more than 20 ingredients per label, and that's not attractive for consumers at all.
Right.
At the same time, there's definitely sort of a push for the, I think you called it clean label, so only having natural whole ingredients.
Hmm.
And I think that can be a tough thing for us to butt our head against, because if you're thinking of bioreactors, even though it's a technology that's been around a long time, people don't like thinking of processing when they're
Right.
thinking of food products. So I think for particular a subset of consumers, this is something that will require education, openness and transparency around the process. When it comes down to it, whether you're growing the cells in a bioreactor or in the body, it's the same process, and one is not more natural than the other. But that does take some consumer education. And I think we have to be a little bit of patient. There's the different consumer sectors. So you have the early adopters, you have
Right.
the people in the middle, and then the people who are more hesitant. So I don't think we should hold back the sector because there are some people who might be hesitant for now. When it really comes down to whether technologies such as this will be commercially viable, most consumers just react to food products based on whether they taste good or not.
Yeah.
And then they're not thinking so hard about what they're eating.
Yes. And I'm sure, as you said, there will always be a subsector or a subgroup of people that are reading the ingredient list and they're going to have one opinion. Other people have a different opinion. But I think to your point, to not hold back the sector and to get it out there. And I think it's a positive thing
Yeah.
to see just from like the climate impact. And ideally we get the price point down, but particularly the climate impact for
Yeah.
some of these products out there.
Might change minds at that point. And
Yeah.
also, I feel like right now we're kind of in a crystal ball moment because you can now purchase this at restaurants, but it's not super widely available. So right now it can be difficult to have conversations around this because you're talking about like what you think people will do, and when it comes down to it, you don't know
Totally.
yet.
Yeah. I could also see this being a space where positioning matters a lot. Like,
Yeah.
the words that we use to describe this, I could see a strong
Yeah.
sell on cruelty free would probably really resonate with some people. Like, I'm sure there's a lot of
Yeah,
innovation
there's
just on the
so much
positioning.
market research
Yeah.
around like how the name of this impacts people. And like I was saying with the education component, there's some great market research. Usually consumers' initial reaction might be 50% might not like it, but then if you actually introduce an educational component and then ask people, okay, are you interested in eating this? You seem the majority of people are interested in eating it. So yeah, there's
Oh,
definitely a good argument for smart education and marketing around this space.
yeah. Very interesting. You mentioned the crystal ball moment. If we take a crystal ball and look at the next couple of years for Genuine Taste, what do the next couple of years look like for the company and maybe some of those big technical and maybe even like regulatory milestones ahead?
Yeah, so next couple of years, we're scaling production. We're getting to around 1,000 tons produced per year, which really enables us to reach sort of the price barrier for mass commercialization. So we're looking at that production level. Our product will be below $10 per kilogram. We'll have regulatory approval. We'll start commercializing, as I mentioned, in pet food products, and also hopefully you'll see this as a ingredient listed on a plant-based product out on the supermarket shelves. Yeah, and we're also, one thing that really excites me about this particular industry is the ability to create high-tech jobs in manufacturing within Canada. So hopefully we've also got some great R&D and production facilities located domestically.
And then if you were to zoom out and think about the alternative proteins sector more generally, in 10 years, where would you like to see this space? What does that world kind of look like?
One analogy that I like to think about is I recently watched a documentary on glass making, very random,
Okay.
but glass naturally occurs. And in the early days of glass making, it was essentially just used because it was water impermeable, so you could use it to hold liquids, but it didn't have many use cases. And now think about, we've introduced so many technological processes to create super durable glass and have many different applications for it. And so it's something that occurs naturally, but with some innovation, you can make so many things with it. And I think in 10 years, the cultivated fat or meat sector will be the same. We'll be able to make these precision ingredients that have the exact right fatty acid profile that you're looking for, and it will be cheaper than conventional alternatives. And on top of that, it will be much more climate friendly. So, in the next 10 years, I'm really hoping that this is a safe ingredient that many people are able to access and that we can safely and sustainably feed the planet.
I love that analogy with glass. It kind of sparks some thoughts about what this could turn into and all the different applications and iterations of it. It's kind of hard to like look around the corner and know what those might be, but it's exciting to think about for sure. We'll end with a quick rapid fire. So the first one, what is a book or magazine, podcast, etc., that you'd recommend to folks listening?
So one climate tech podcast that I do like is The Catalyst with Shail Khan. So that
Nice.
gives you a great overview of the climate tech sector. Yeah.
Perfect. What's something that you're really excited about this year, either personally or professionally?
I would say professionally for the startup, one thing I'm really excited about is right now I feel like we're on the cusp of scale up and we have a lot of moving pieces coming together that I think the latter half of this year is going to be really exciting because I think we're going to get to the point where we do like a public demonstration event. We've scaled up and into larger bioreactors, so I'm very excited to see what the end of this year holds for our company.
Nice. That's an exciting feeling, like being
Yeah.
on the cusp. You can see that
Yeah,
momentum
it's
paying
like
off.
looking back at the last year of all the little things I was doing and then
Yeah.
finally coming together.
Yeah. And then what's a piece of advice you would give to someone that's looking to start their own venture?
I would say for someone who's looking to start their own venture, I would say network, 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 especially with other founders. There are a lot of different ways you can trip up or a lot of shortcuts you can take in terms of like accessing resources or how to talk to customers, and your best resource is to talk to other founders.
Yeah. I've seen some of those conversations happening and like the unlock that it creates is very exciting. Maybe just to double click on that. So you mentioned you met your co founder through this matching event. Any advice or thoughts on finding the right co founder?
In terms of finding the right co-founder, I would say make sure your values are aligned in terms of why you're working on the startup. I think that can be really important. And then also make sure that it's an enjoyable person to work with, like that you mesh well together. Because at the end of the day, I think as a startup, like your general field might remain the same, but the technology might change, things might evolve. I think the most important things when starting a startup is making sure that you work well together with your co founder.
Perfect. Okay. And then any final ask for folks listening or, where they could learn more about the company?
Yeah, so if you are a potential customer, so say you're an alternative meat company, ingredient company, pet food company, we would love to talk to you. Please reach out to us. We're also currently raising a round, so if you're an investor and interested in the space or what you've heard, please also reach out to us. Our contact email is contact@genuinetaste.co. And then we also have a website where you can find our contact information. That's just genuinetaste.co.
Perfect. Emily, thanks so much for spending some time and going into the weeds with me. I really appreciate it. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for your thoughtful questions.